Welcome to Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. With Paige, your caffeine-imbued host. Thinking with his mouth open since Noah tarred the ark. This podcast is sponsored by Up and Away Junk Hauling, a Christian-owned and operated junk removal service serving the Atlanta area. They offer white-collar service in a blue-collar industry, fair prices, and no-cost estimates, with a commitment to donate and recycle whenever possible. Book online at upandawayjunk.com or call 404-909-4183. Ask for Taylor. He's the owner and a friend of mine. Up and Away Junk Hauling, helping lighten your load. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Paige. I am Paige, your caffeine-imbued host. Here's my caffeine. In the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. Well, today we're episode 38 in my series in Romans, and we're going to be talking about verses 15 through 18 of chapter 6. Today, Paul talks a lot about slavery, and there's a lot of really good stuff in here that applies to us. Just as a caveat, if you're listening or reading this study or watching this on YouTube, my studies are not exhaustive in the sense that they cover every word and every jot and every tittle of every verse that Paul speaks of. I read a passage and I speak to what speaks to me. In Psalms 1, it says, "Blessed is a man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and in it he meditates day and night." The word meditate means to talk to yourself aloud about something, to mutter to yourself. That's kind of what I'm doing here. There is so much that Paul is offering up in this book of Romans. I am not qualified to chase everything down. I'm just not. I'm not a seminary trained Christian. I have 2 master's degrees, so I'm intelligent in the sense that I can research and I can write and I can think. And that's basically what you're seeing me doing. You're seeing me think with my mouth open. So, though I will not cover everything there is to be covered, I will be covering what jumps out at me. Because at the end of the day, these Bible studies, well, it's kind of selfish sounding maybe, but it's about me. It's not about you. I want to be a better follower of Christ today than I was yesterday. I want to be a better follower of Christ tomorrow than I am today. I want to be what Psalms 1 says, that man whose delights in the law of the Lord. It says it becomes like a tree planted by streams. His fruit prospers. His leaf doesn't wither. That's what I want. I want to be a powerful representative of the King that I serve. So I read the Bible and I study the Bible. So what you're getting is not an exhaustive study of Romans. You're getting Paige's study of Romans and what God is talking to Paige about. And today, God is talking to me about slavery. So let's get right at it. Verses 15, starting with verse 15, Paul revisits an old question. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? He gives the same answer he gave before. By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you're slaves of the one you obey? Whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You've been set free from sin and become slaves to righteousness. All right. As I mentioned, Paul returns to the question. he first raised in verses 1 and 2. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning that grace may increase? His answer is the same. By no means. To reinforce that answer, Paul introduces the illustration of slavery and explains what it means to be under the authority of a master. In doing so, he revisits the human condition he described in chapters 1 through 3, but from a different perspective. Rather than focusing primarily on humanity's guilt before God, Paul now emphasizes the humanity's bondage to sin. His point is that sin is not merely something people do, it's a power that rules over them. The question then is not whether believers should continue in sin, but which master will you serve? Christ or sin? In verse 16 it says, don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? Right? Whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you've come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You've been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. Now, to understand Paul's illustration here, it helps to understand slavery in the first century Roman world. Unlike the race-based slavery that developed in more recent centuries, Roman slavery was primarily a legal and social status. Slaves came from many different ethnic and national backgrounds throughout the empire. People became slaves in a variety of ways. Some were captured in war, sold into slavery. Some were victims of kidnapping and trafficking by slave traders. In earlier periods of Roman history, debt slavery was common. In this case, offering yourself up to be a slave was your way to erase a debt. Debt slavery, though, by the first century, had pretty much been abolished by Roman citizens, but it was still there. Others entered slavery or forced servitude as a punishment for crimes. Convicted criminals could be assigned to work in mines, quarries, or state labor projects. Last but certainly not least, others were born into slavery as children of enslaved parents. Well, in Paul's words, I can see elements of two brands of slavery in Romans. On the one hand, Paul tells us we're born into sin, according to chapters 1, 2, and 3. We are slaves to sin. The only way out is to be purchased by someone else. In that case, you aren't freed in the ultimate sense of the word. You become the property of another master. On the other hand, Paul speaks of offering yourselves up to a master, sin. Don't you know that when you offer yourself to sin, that's what he says here, you obligate yourself to this master. Unlike debt slavery, which is pretty much wiped out by the first century mentioned previously, there was no way this debt could be wiped out by the slave. It would take someone else to pay the debt in order for that slave to be freed. In both of these examples, it takes an outside party to deliver someone from their old master. These are the versions of slavery I see Paul referencing regarding humanity. Everyone's a slave to sin. Part of the kingdom of the one who hates us most, Satan. Those who are slaves to sin are not struggling to leave their slavery. On the contrary, they continually volunteer their services to their master, to sin, to Satan. The only way out of this situation is for an outsider to come along and pay the purchase price for that slave. Can you see now why Paul uses slavery as a model to demonstrate mankind's condition? This model of slavery forms the basis of his spiritual application. Every person has a master. Every person serves a master. All of us are born into sin, and the only way out from that servitude is to be purchased by a new master into a new kingdom, one who is benevolent, not injurious, one who loves, not one who hates. Now, Paul's readers would have understood slavery as a condition that began when a person came under the ownership and authority of another. A slave did not determine his own course in life. He belonged to a master, and his actions, obligations, and future were all shaped by that relationship. In Romans 6, Paul uses this familiar reality to describe humanity's relationship to sin. In Romans 6:17, it says, "You were slaves of sin." Paul's not merely saying that people commit sinful acts from time to time. His point is deeper. Apart from Christ, people live under the authority and dominion of sin. Sin is not an action. It's a master. It directs, it controls, it ultimately destroys those who serve it. And just as a slave could not simply walk away from his master's authority, so sinners cannot free themselves from the power of sin through their own efforts. But then Paul introduces the glorious truth of the gospel when he says, "But having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." Notice that Paul does not describe believers as becoming autonomous or independent. In the Roman world, a freed slave did not necessarily become completely detached from all obligations. More importantly, Paul's illustration is not about independence, but about a transfer of allegiance. Believers have been released from one master and placed under another. We're not independent contractors. Our masters choose us. Satan chooses us at our birth as we're all born into sin. God chooses us at our justification after paying the redemption price. This is a crucial point in Paul's argument. The gospel does not free us to belong to ourselves. It frees us from the tyranny of sin, yes, but so that we may belong to Christ. We are no longer under the dominion of sin. We are now under the gracious lordship of righteousness and obedience to God. For Paul's first century audience, this would have painted a vivid picture of redemption. Salvation means a change of a master, a change of status, therefore a change of life. The old master demanded sin and paid wages in death. The new master leads his servants in righteousness and grants the gift of eternal life. This brings us back to a foundational truth. There's no spiritual Switzerland. There's no place where autonomy rules. There is no neutral territory where a person belongs to no one and serves nothing. Remember when Paul wrote this in chapter 3 when he says there's none righteous, not one? There's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They've together become worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. That's the description of slavery under the master called sin. The whole concept of being a slave to sin or a slave to righteousness can be unsettling. For many people, it immediately raises objections. And I get it. We instinctively resist the idea of being anyone's servant or subject. In a culture that prizes freedom, independence, and personal choice here in America, the language of slavery sounds offensive and restrictive no matter who the master is. That reaction is especially strong in America. From our earliest days, we've celebrated the ideals of liberty, self-determination, individual rights. We're taught that we should chart our own course, make our own decisions, answer to no one but ourselves. The language of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is woven deeply into the American psyche. Freedom is not merely a political value. It has become a personal virtue. We admire the self-made individual, the independent thinker, the person who refuses to be controlled by anyone else. And because of that cultural background, Paul's words in Romans 6 can sound jarring. We naturally want a third option. We want to say, I'm not a slave to sin, but neither am I a slave to righteousness. I'm free. I belong to myself. I am not a slave. But I'm sorry. Paul doesn't offer that option here in Romans. In his understanding, true neutrality does not exist. Every person lives under some ruling authority. The question is not whether we will serve a master, but which master we will serve. Before Christ, people live under the dominion of sin. Sin is not merely something they occasionally do. It's the power that exercises authority over them. Through faith in Christ, however, believers are transferred into a new realm. They are set free from sin's mastery and brought under the lordship of righteousness. What sounds restrictive at first is actually liberating. Paul is not describing a change from slavery to freedom. He's describing a change from one master to another, from a cruel tyrant that destroys life to a gracious Lord who gives life. The freedom Christ provides is not the freedom to belong to ourselves. It's the freedom to become what God created us to be. In Paul's thinking, the greatest freedom is not autonomy, but joyful submission to the one who loves us, redeems us, and leads us into true life. Now, in Romans 6:17, I'm going to read that to you again. So let me get up here to it. Romans verse 17 reads, let me find it. I know it's here somewhere. Come out with your hands up. There we go. But thanks be to God. You see, he's a turning point. He just talked about being slaves. And he turns the corner and says, but, or in opposition to this, thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. I was drawn into doing just a teeny little study on the Greek used in this verse and the verbs. The verb, you were delivered from, or you were handed over, is one of the most striking words in Romans 6:17. It comes from the Greek word blah, 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 which I can't pronounce, meaning to hand over, deliver, entrust, or transfer into another's care. Paul uses the aorist tense, pointing to a decisive action that took place in the believer's past. The passive voice is especially important here because it indicates the believers were acted upon. They did not place themselves into this new position of becoming a slave to righteousness. God himself was the one who brought about this transfer. What makes Paul's wording so remarkable here is that he doesn't say the teaching was handed over to you. No, he says, instead of, let me rephrase this. Sometimes I get my tongue wrapped around my eye tooth and I can't see what I'm saying. He isn't saying the Christian teaching was handed over to you. You were handed over to it. Paul reverses the picture and says you were handed over to a pattern of teaching of Christianity. And the emphasis is not merely that the gospel message came to them, but that they were brought under its authority and influence. You were taken from one place and put into another. This fits perfectly with Paul's larger argument in Romans 6. Earlier, he explained that believers were once slaves to sin, living under his authority and dominion. But through the saving work of Christ, God transfers them into an entirely new realm. They were delivered from the mastery of sin and placed under the authority of the gospel. In other words, they didn't simply learn a new set of rules. They were entrusted to a new master and a new way of life. Now, the verb therefore paints a vivid picture of conversion. God took those who were formerly under the rule of sin, handed them over to the truth of the gospel, where their lives would now be shaped by Christ's character, Christ's teaching, as opposed to being shaped by Satan's teaching, Satan's character. It's a language of transfer, allegiance, transformation, a decisive movement from one kingdom to another, from one master to another, from one way of life to another. Now, if there is a problem with this concept, or should I say a perceived problem, it's that there's no mention of our choice in this matter. Our new master purchased us, and we were then handed over to this teaching, to this gospel. This is the beginning of the one major divide in Christian theology, today known as Reformed theology versus Arminianism. In a grossly oversimplified statement, I might say it's a discussion of man's free will to choose as opposed to God's complete control in his choosing. Much of the Reformed argument is based on passages such as this one. You can't escape Paul's analogy of us being handed over to righteousness. Not walking over to righteousness as a choice of our own, but we're being handed over to righteousness, to the teaching of the gospel. It's a part of a transaction of which we really have no part other than being transferred. Deep thoughts from the Apostle Paul. But he says in verse 17, thanks be to God, you used to be slave to sin, you've come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching. All right. He says you were. You used to be. He says you used to be slaves to sin, or you were a slave to sin. It describes the believer's former condition. They were slaves to sin. The imperfect tense points to a continuous state in the past. In other words, it wasn't an occasional problem that cropped up here and then, or a series of isolated failures. It was a settled condition. You were settled there. You were living there. Sin was your master. You lived under its authority. Then he says, you've come to obey from your heart the gospel. Unlike the imperfect verb that describes what just happened, the ongoing past condition being captive to sin, this verb points to a decisive act. At a specific point, they responded to the gospel. More than that, they obeyed from the heart. Their response was not merely external conformity or intellectual agreement. It was a sincere inward submission to the truth of God. It wasn't that you just found a new set of rules to follow. You really wanted to follow these rules. It was the desire of your heart. Your heart was to oppose the old master. Your heart pushed you into living in this new gospel under a new master. It wasn't just adopting a set of rules. You really wanted it. And then Paul uses the verb that's translated, you've come to obey from your heart, that has now claimed your intelligence. Okay. You were handed over. That's another way of saying that. You were delivered or has claimed your allegiance. This is another verb, but appears in the passive voice. In other words, passive voice in Greek means this is not something you did. It was something that was done to you. The believers didn't place themselves into this new position. God acted on their behalf. They were handed over to a new pattern of teaching, transferred into a new realm of authority and truth. God took those who had lived under the mastery of sin and placed them under the shaping influence of the gospel. Now, taken together, these three verbs tell the entire story of salvation. You were under sin. You have a heartfelt response to the gospel, and you were transferred into a new sphere of obedience and righteousness. Now, there is a striking reversal in Paul's imagery in this chapter. Early in the chapter, believers were described as slaves to sin. Sin was their master. They lived under its authority and control. They belonged to one kingdom, served one ruler. But now Paul describes them differently. They've been handed over to a pattern of teaching. In other words, they've come under a new authority. One example that comes to mind was when I was 18, I joined the Navy. I went from one world into a totally different world. I went from a world in Sitka, Alaska, where I'd grown up, where I was free to run and do what I wanted to do. If I wanted to go hunting, I went hunting. If I wanted to go fishing, I went fishing. If I wanted to run through the woods like a monkey, I did. But when I got to the Navy, I was transferred into a whole new world, whole new set of rules, whole new set of regulations. And at first it seemed cruel and inhuman. But the Navy is a world, the military is a world that has a set of rules that must be followed. And the rules are for your good. I was transferred into a new way of living. And I had to learn the new rules. And it wouldn't be enough. I wouldn't be the same man today if I just decided to try to adopt those rules without going into the Navy. I had to be put into the Navy to understand discipline, to understand structure, to understand a chain of command, to understand the order of things. And because when you're in the Navy and you're out at sea, you can't call a fire department. You can't call it a police department. You had to be part of a unit that understood how things went so that you could exist in this world. Yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. Paul's telling them, you've been handed over to a pattern of teaching. You've come under a new authority. The language echoes the transfer of ownership that runs throughout chapter 6. The believer has not moved from slavery to independence. He has been moved from one master to another. Once they were under dominion of sin, now they belong to Christ. Once their lives are directed by sin's demands and headed towards death, now their lives are shaped by the truth of the gospel and guided by their obedience to God. The authority of sin has been broken and a new allegiance has been established. This is Paul's point. Salvation is not merely a forgiveness of sins. It's a transfer of lordship. Believers have been rescued from one kingdom, brought to another. They no longer lived under the authority of sin. They now belong to Christ and live under the authority of apostolic teaching and the righteousness of God. Whew. Deep stuff from the Apostle Paul, folks. I think I'll just leave that right there. I'm Paige. Here's my caffeine. It's still good. Have a glorious day. God bless you. Bye-bye. You have been watching or listening to Coffee, the Bible and Paige, with your host, Paige C. Garwood. Thinking with his mouth open since 1975.